Thank you, David. And first off, kudos for putting this leadership program together. I think, all aspiring entrepreneurs, managers that want to take more leadership need opportunities to share stories and hear and develop mentors. And mentors, can be people that you don't know firsthand, but you just admire them based on their body of work and things that they write and the words that they use and how they carry themselves. And I think one of the first things that I did to prepare today was to actually look up each of you, as it's easy to do on LinkedIn and your company websites, because there were some companies that I was not familiar with, and what a diverse group you are. Several lawyers, we have the utilities, we have solar interests, we have very impressive, two companies working in the nuclear field, still an industry that we need. We have investors, software and engineering services, and manufacturing. So quite a broad group. And I'm, also, noticed that several of you have very long careers with your companies, which is a bit unusual these days. People do tend to move around a lot more. So, as you look at, leadership in your own organizations and how, succession planning is such a big factor. One of the challenges that I've always found is, people don't stay long enough to have that industry knowledge and establish themselves within an organization to move up. But for those that have put in the years at one company, I think it says a lot. It probably speaks to the fact that you've had a big impact on how those companies have grown and evolved. And you're probably very respected among your colleagues. And that just shows that you've been able to learn leadership in that environment. What I will like to say is that I had an amazing career, more than 40 years, graduated from the University of Georgia with an accounting degree, got into business from the accounting point of view. Great place to start out. You see everything, the numbers don't lie, but I think it was just a way to get more involved in operations. I've always been operating bent. I like to run companies and organizations efficiently. And about 8 years into my career, I was fortunate to be recruited by Jerry Zucker, the late Jerry Zucker, and the InterTech Group was really founded back in around 1986. And that was the year that I came on board with them. And I mention that because it was as a result of that organization that I got lots of different management experience that prepared me for leadership at a very early stage. And I think the one constant is that when you do something different every year, you get a lot of experience and people, recognize that and they come to you. So, even if you're in a role that you've done for many years, you've had to change how you do that job. And this pandemic has, brought that home more than anything. I mean, we're doing this virtually, and that's a very challenging forum. I grew up where you develop trust by looking somebody in the eye and reading their body language and spending time with them. And Zoom is great, but it doesn't replace what we're missing. And I kind of ramble a little bit, but I'm still involved in transactions. And right now I'm involved in transactions in Canada. And I can't go to Canada. I can't do the kick the tires and the face-to-face negotiations to close deals. And one of my Canadian companies does business internationally. So large infrastructure projects, Middle East, Southeast Asia. Again, they're Canadian. They could travel, but they got a 14-week quarantine to come back. So I guess what I'm saying is business right now is incredibly challenging to get projects and big things off the ground. And I'm still really looking for the right solutions to do that. I would be curious to hear later in our time from you on how you're managing that. But going back to just my career for a moment, I started out working for the InterTech Group acquisition that we bought from DuPont. It was a non-wovens facility, and Today nonwovens are like gold. It's what makes all the surgical masks and all the surgical protection equipment. So we bought those entities from Johnson and Johnson, and some down in Florida and some in Mexico, I should say. And that was really my first experience with taking a company public. We did a huge roadshow both in Europe and across all of North America, and it exposed me to the public realm of companies. But it also exposed me to some amazing technology, and through that, I was tasked to go to Canada and operate a facility about 3 hours north of Toronto. So literally at the end of the road, if you like to think about it. And that's really where I got my leadership experience. We were sort of remote, and back in the 80s, Canada, that was before NAFTA, so Canada was a different environment. And when I went up there, I was basically allowed to do whatever I felt needed to be done to run a company. So I went up there as a general manager. Prior to that, I was a vice president of vice president of manufacturing, still wearing a financial hat. But I was given the reins to run a 300-person, 24/7 plastic processing operation in Canada, in a very remote village that, like going back 20 years in time, and still that way. But a great, great experience to make the connections and hone my leadership skills. And I kind of get choked up because it was an amazing group of people that I worked with up there. And it taught me very early on, it's the teams that you work with that get things done. And I know that's an overused phrase, but you can't understate how important it is to surround yourself with people that are different from yourself. You don't want yes men. I think it was said that, that makes one of you redundant. You want people that bring different ideas, that challenge what is being done, but once decisions are made, are capable of getting on board and pulling together. So the teams that you build and the teams that you work with, and sometimes you don't have the luxury of building that team. You're assigned to a group, or your superiors decide who your colleagues and subordinates are. And you got to work with those people regardless if they fit the mode that you're looking for. And that's really probably one of the most essential leadership skills I've always realized, is how to connect with people and recognizing that everybody connects differently. And sometimes it's a real challenge. So I mentioned about my career in Canada because that was really the stepping stone. From there, I just moved on to be president and CEO of a series of companies, and in each one, the common denominator really was things needed to get fixed. They needed to grow. They needed to address an issue with the business. And in each case, you tackle those problems. You tackle them head on. And so as my career evolved, and I was able to spend a lot of time in the Charleston area working for the Zuckers, but working on companies all over the place. Around 2004, we were a bit upset about the way energy pricing was going in our state, and started to get a little more involved in it. And that's actually when I first met Bonnie in 2004. We worked on a piece of legislation in South Carolina that, essentially opened up solar energy in South Carolina. And since that time, there's been follow-on legislation, and South Carolina has really moved ahead. But in 2004, we really were a bit of a backwater on the renewable energy front. And even though we were recruiting companies from all over the world, trying to, establish ourselves as a world-renowned manufacturing hub, we really didn't have a renewable energy policy as such. Our energy policy at the time was we're building nuclear reactors, and we know how that turned out. And unfortunately, we didn't really have anything, in reserve. But because of some of the work we did in 2004, renewables have accelerated, and I think they're taking a spot. So I'm going to digress for a moment. My business activities in Canada are in Alberta, and Alberta is an oil province, and our business is in the oil services industry. And in 2015, BP put out an energy outlook forecast to 2035. So it's basically a 20-year look forward in 2015. And amazingly, they believe that oil prices and demand for oil was going to just continue. And that clearly hasn't been the case. And today, we're less than 100 drilling rigs in North America, and down to less than 10 in Canada, exploration. But even active wells are being shut in. Something's going on with energy that doesn't feel like it's going to go back to the old ways, certainly for oil and gas. Fracking is where we've had some incredible innovation and has been able to essentially become self-dependent on oil. But even fracking is proven to be less sustainable than we thought. And even though I'm as well read as I can be, the thing that really struck me was when that Atlantic Coast pipeline was canceled. And what did that really say about what the real experts are seeing and what they feel the future is? So, clearly new energy sources are part of the future, but we still have to manage the mature end of the life cycle for oil and petroleum products. They're still going to be a big and huge part of our economy, but it's interesting to see how those players are trying to transition to do business models. So a lot of upheaval and disruption. How do you take a company that's dependent on oil its whole life, 30 years or more, and then change it into a new business? And one of the things that we're doing is looking at software and data and how to become more efficient with that data. And I think it was I look here, Steve with Studsvik, and you're doing software and engineering services, and that as actually some of the strategies that we're looking at to manage the efficiencies of that industry. More importantly, in my solar experience, we've been monitoring our solar activity, our solar facilities remotely since we built the first one in 2005. A lot of data comes from that, but how that data is being utilized, I don't feel that I'm getting all of the benefits of the data that's being collected. There's still a lot of room in the data analytics side of development, and so that's an area that I'm looking forward to. And then I think just generally speaking, the philosophy that we've had within the InterTech Group, at least, is that we can be more efficient with the generation sources that we have if we can smooth out the load curve. Our peak load curves are not best served by having idle generation 70% of the time. The technologies that are storing energy, battery technologies, and those technologies that manage local loads and match them better are the technologies that I'm encouraged to see more of. And I think that's also where a lot of entrepreneurial juice will flow and already is. One of the things that I'll pause for a moment. Does anybody have any questions about where I came from? Like I said, my experience in the energy market has always been as a consumer of energy and an advocate for better public policy. And I know some of you actually are heavily involved in policy, and I wanted to mention Becca from Sunrun. Are you there? You are. So you've been involved in a lot of policy, and it's pretty involved and very, you have to go very deep into how policy is developed and then how to sell policy. And, this kind of comes back to those relationships and understanding what everybody's interests are. Many times people agree on a decision, but they agree for different reasons. Their interests may be different from others. And I think it's a key when you're trying to build consensus is to find the rationale that other people can support that gets to a common conclusion or a common policy that you can put forward. What I think we see today is two extremes, and what we were proud of in 2014 was a collaborative approach to finding common ground. It wasn't about what we disagree on, but what do we agree on, and can we put that forward and show it as progress. And it was very satisfying when we did that, because things actually went very, very quickly and very smoothly. But as more people get involved and more opinions come to the table, you have to manage even more points of view, and that is very challenging. But the way you build consensus is to build on common ideas and not throw thoughts or ideas that are not popular out, but put them aside, and sometimes you come back to them, and sometimes the answers reveal themselves on the best path forward. But I think we all recognize, as leaders, you want to show accomplishments, you want to move the ball forward somehow, but you don't want to do it in a way that you regret. In other words, you don't want to make a bad decision for the sake of doing something. So, having good judgment in your decisions is vital. And, on that point, sometimes, you're faced, with a decision in your career where, you feel like you're probably the most qualified person to make a decision, but for whatever reason, the chain of command, your boss, whoever you answer to, you get pushback, and you're not sure how to manage that. You want to go forward with what you think is the right outcome. You've done the homework. You feel like you know better than anybody what to do, and you're being told to stop or halt or change your mind. How do you deal with that situation? That's a question that always comes up. And the more that you challenge and push the boundaries, the more you're going to be faced with how to convince others. And so my view is that, management is easy. You command respect because you're technically proficient, you're an expert in your field, and others, junior to you, are looking for advice, and you tell them, what to do. But the next level, the level that really represents leadership, is really the political level. Your power is no longer the authority to tell someone to do it. Your power is your power of persuasion, the veracity of your arguments, the coalitions that you've built. You're trying to get things done, not because you can tell somebody to do it from a position of power, but because they believe in what you're saying to be the right way. And that, I think, is the most important way to move folks forward. And that involves an element of compromise. It certainly involves keeping an open mind. I find myself many times where I've done more due diligence, more homework. I've seen certain situations before and similar to the current situation. And so I have a pretty good idea of what needs to happen, but I still have to convince my colleagues, my other board directors, on why we should go forward. And it's not good enough for them to say, I trust Grant. Don't ever just trust somebody. I mean, trust is built over years of track record, and trust is amazing. You can do things very quickly when you have trust with the people you're working with. But don't ever abdicate your responsibility to test what you're being told. It's important that you believe and you trust someone, because it rings true. You know, it's something that sounds right to you, or if it's unknown to you, you do the research to go dig it out. In today's world, it's pretty easy to fact check everything, and I encourage you to do that. There's a lot of anecdotal stories that get used as facts, and I think it's more important to take a broader view. One thing I'll also just mention on that subject is when you're making big decisions, I always like to take my time. I never want to rush, and I want to sleep on it. I might want to sleep on it for a few days. I find you can prepare the thoughts in your head to support why you're making your decision. And if you can't articulate it clearly and believe in it and back it up with the facts, and then have some pretty qualified people that agree with you, then you're probably not prepared to push hard. You need to decide if that's the fight that you want to have. You're only going to get to fight so many times and win, and you're going to lose. So very important to pick your battles carefully and decide what really matters and what does matter. I mean, your career matters. Your principles matter. There's a lot of people being tested these days, and I'm sure all of you have been tested, will be tested, and it comes from every direction: your customers, your bosses, your colleagues, your suppliers, the institutions you depend on. All of those things have to work in order for us to do a good job. And just by virtue of you being here today says a lot about why you think it's important to develop the skills you need to give other people a sense of command, that the right people are doing the right thing and for the right reasons. And so I could go on a bit more. I'm keeping an eye on my time. I think I'm doing pretty good. I did make some other notes.
You're doing great on time, Grant. Thank you. Got about another 25 minutes or so if you want.
Sure. So I heard Elizabeth talking a bit about the future and some of the opportunities that are going on in Charleston. And this is a leadership course, and I'd certainly like to also talk about where I see some opportunities. But now that I'm sort of winding down my career, I realize there's a lot of things that are left to be done with the way we operate our companies and how we deal with all of our stakeholders. Our stakeholders fall into many groups, and for our utility participants, given customers great service and reliability, affordability, I mean, people absolutely depend on our utilities every day. They take them for granted. But we also have new opportunities to manage our energy, whether we generate it at home or we manage our loads at home differently, or we find efficiencies. And at the business level, it's also true. I mean, we're always looking for ways to be more efficient. And at an industrial scale, those savings, actually turn into very large dollar amounts. We have this phenomenon in the U.S. where we're using less power per capita, and it's going to continue. The efficiencies of electronics are going to just require less power, and our rates won't overcome that. There'll be regions like in Charleston where demand will continue to grow, but there's many regions where you're flat. One of the big ideas for the co-ops, and I know we have a couple on our line, is the providing high-speed internet access to the rural communities. That is so understood. And I happen to be one of, I live north, you know, doing my it's a bit erratic and doesn't support data very well. That's a very huge underserved need right now, a big opportunity for the technology that can bring high-speed internet to the rural, just as they brought electrification back in the 50s. So I wrote down one other note, and this one speaks to something that's very much in the news these days, and it really, I think, comes around to how we deal with other people, and in particular racial inequality. As leaders, if you don't understand the subject, if you don't understand what the issues are and how how you should deal with it in your professional career, then you should invest the time to do so. The Riley Institute in South Carolina provides an excellent diversity course. I took it a couple of years ago, and it was tough. I mean, it was hard. It was hard. It was hard to face biases that you didn't think you had, but you did have. And so, there's an awakening that's going on, and as managers in your careers, you just have to navigate it. I'm not suggesting you navigate it any particular way, but you got to be thoughtful about it, because as spokespersons for your companies, you got to have the right answer, and if you handle it poorly, you'll regret it. And if you haven't given some thought to it, you absolutely ought to. It's something that as a country and as a community and as organizations, everybody handles it differently, and they have to be sensitive to their own demographics. But I see tremendous opportunity to make some strides where it's been frankly neglected, it would seem. But that's really all I want to say on that. But I feel in the subject of developing leadership, it's one that deserves your attention. If you haven't taken a diversity class, and you think you have no biases, and there's nothing in your reputation to be worried about, you'd be surprised what you find when you look deep.
Great comment on diversity. And interestingly, 3 out of our 4 speakers today have raised that as an element of their leadership development. Now, I want to take a step further. It's a great point for those in the leadership program, I'm an old guy, so I was boots on the ground in college in 1969, and the experiences that went with all that. But as I've grown older and have thought about this topic of diversity, the easy elements of diversity, are becoming more apparent. The more subtle ones are the ones that are really getting tricky right now. And we've had, and Elizabeth touched on this previously, but we before had a political system where there was collegiality, and over time, particularly during this last decade, we've had a situation where politics has become an element of diversity where it really was not before. Where now when you choose a political party, it denotes a very distinct and separate philosophy with regard to governing and culture and what may have you. There's a diversity with regard to to the economy.
Mhm.
In the last decade, we've seen, a huge spread occur between high net worth individuals and, most of the rest of the population. And, that gap has increased. And, you can even look at something such as the pandemic, where philosophies with regard to what you believe about the pandemic puts people on two distinctly different sides of a viewpoint. So, we as a people, at least in the United States, and even in business, are finding that, it's not just a limited number of distinctions that define diversity anymore, but there's a lot of subtleties to it. And as a leader, you really have to have intuition, and you have to have emotional intelligence about it, and you have to always be aware about, what element is dividing, is distinguishing, is separating the group that I want to lead. But it's a great point that you raise.
Well, look, I mentioned I was in Canada. I was actually born in Canada. My parents immigrated from England, so I landed in Toronto, and I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years old, they ended up in Detroit, and so I grew up in Detroit in the 50s. I mean, how Americana can you be? And eventually, ended up in Cobb County, Georgia, where I really
Yeah.
grew up. So I was an immigrant boy in in northern Atlanta during segregation. I mean, I came into a very strange place, at a strange time. But I became an American citizen on graduation from University of Georgia. I love this country, but I also, see a culture in Canada that's a little bit different, and how they handle their diversity and how it's there. But that doesn't apply here. This is a very different country from Canada, and what makes this country great, you don't ever want to discourage that, the creativity, the entrepreneurial, break it and let's make something new. This is what makes this country great. And I'm so proud of that element of it. But it doesn't mean that we can't learn from others. In business, there's a few sort of playbooks you always go with. If you got a great product that works in one place, take it to a new place. So just, go find another geography for that same product or service. That can apply to so many things. And in the U.S., we have this ability to innovate and move quickly, and we can do that by incorporating the views of other people. We talk about diversity, and that also goes to gender diversity. I work on boards, corporate boards, public company boards, and there's a big push to have better representation of females on boards, and it's really hard to actually bring that about. The number of qualified women that are want to be on boards is somewhat limiting, but it is something that is so valuable. I've been on boards where a message went out and it was totally blind to a woman's point of view, and it wasn't until you have other people looking at things from a different side that you get better decisions. And that's really why you want to include people from other perspectives, to a point. Yeah, it can get a little unwieldy if you have too many opinions. Well, listen, I don't have a lot more I want to say, but Bonnie, I'll hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you for being here. Grant is, you mentioned it, and I never thought of you in this way until you mentioned it just now. I mean, you are definitely someone that I consider a mentor. Have grown and learned so much through working for you and with you. And your comment about, it takes a team approach is one that resonates with me, because you approach everything in that manner, no matter the chair somebody is sitting in, or the rank that they have, or what they're bringing to the table, and that's most appreciated for me on a personal level. I'm curious, you mentioned at the end of your comments that you felt like there were some opportunities for us in the diversity area. And, I don't know if you're willing to share maybe what one or two of those might be that you see. I mean, I feel like you are someone who, you keep your eyes on the horizon as much as anybody that I've ever interacted with, I believe. And I'm just kind of curious to pick your brain on what some of those opportunities might be. As a DLI grad, that was something that we had brought up in a prior conversation. And it's an interesting time in regard to diversity.
Well, right. I think diversity, so much of what we do with our business comes down to how we message what we want to accomplish. So I've put a lot of emphasis on the message, and to the point where you just go over the words too many times. But it's in messaging where you want to get different perspectives. The hardest thing is to not say something that ought to be said. Many times you will include, sort of, cliches and mother pie type comments. But what people really want is they want a message that tells them something that they haven't heard, but it resonates with them for a particular reason. If you're selling a product, or if you're selling a service, or if you're selling a new program, or if you're wanting to raise your electric rates, Byron, are you there? You have a message that you want to get out that resonates. I mean, nobody likes a price increase, but it's a necessary part of business. I mean, costs go up, and if you explain it in your message well, you can get acceptance. And that requires that you don't write the message from your point of view to people that think like you. It's about, who is your audience and who's best equipped to understand what matters to them. What are they listening for? So whatever message you're putting out there, you have many audiences. Now, the most important audience is the one that you want them to do something, buy your product, or agree to your proposal. But there's tangential stakeholders that you just want them to be neutral. One of the things I learned, Bonnie, when I was spending time at the Capitol, at the State House, doing our advocating for solar, was, they told me it's not who your friends are. Just don't make any enemies. You want people to either be neutral or support you. But if somebody gets a burr in their saddle and they want to go against you, that's a death knell. And in the South Carolina legislative process, it only takes one senator to do that, and we know that. I think actually that gentleman's on one of the boards of the companies that I noticed today. But nonetheless, we have outspoken people everywhere, and that's part of the environment we live with, and how you handle them. But to your question, I don't know, Bonnie, if I'm giving you a good example, but I think in messaging is where you really want to be sure that it's not coming from a singular, all the stakeholders. And sometimes it's really smart to target a portion of that to just show what is important. If you take a position that helps a constituency that is struggling, other members of that constituency will see that and have hopefully positive views of that. So sometimes what you do for other people affects how your image and your reputation is built. And
I think that did answer my question, Grant, and it's a really good point, because Well, first of all, there are so many messages being delivered and received these days. There's so many ways to deliver and receive messages, but it also is fitting with the sort of overall theme of this particular portion of our program, because we've been talking about business communication this time. And you know, I would call it micro targeting, sort of, you know, trying to draw out one little nugget that you put into your message that's going to resonate with, you know, perhaps a small portion of your audience, but that's a portion that really can be beneficial. Can also be very harmful if you don't neutralize or gain their support. And it goes to diversity. I mean, there are so many different perspectives. That's an aspect of diversity that is not visible, but that we do have to keep in mind. Thanks.
This is Becca from Sunrun. I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm sorry I missed your few minutes. I had to step out for a call. But I've really enjoyed everything I've heard, and I really appreciate that you brought up diversity and inclusion as part of being a leader. Especially with, you know, some of the social upheaval we've been seeing with racial inequality. I really think that it's a good time for us all to reflect about, you know, as this group, we aspire to become people leaders, and thinking about all those people we're leading and truly being authentic and trying to understand where they're coming from. And I personally, like many of us, am not perfect at that. And I'm really using it as an important time to listen from others who are ahead of me on it, and from others who just have different perspectives. But, you know, for me personally, being a female in the South, who is white, I think that I have certainly never been a racist, but I don't think that I've also been a good anti-racist. And maybe like in my office settings and in my friend settings, trying to be a little more authentic with some of the perspectives that I'm hearing, taking them in, making people feel heard, and then turning that into action with other groups and other, you know, other companies or other offices, and trying to be very consistent and hold myself accountable. And like you said, not just paying lip service to some ideas because there's some sort of a local or regional metric that requires, you know, a certain head count of women on a board or something like that, but like really authentically appreciating how different perspectives can help you reach a better place. I think is really important as a leader of teams moving forward. And I think it's a way to set ourselves apart from other people, you know, as we compete for positions and as we want to advance our careers and become the best that we can be. I think that someone who really appreciates that and internalizes it and practices it has a lot more potential as a leader. So I really appreciate you bringing it up. I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Becca.
Anyone else have a comment or a question they'd like to share with Grant?
Hi, Byron.
How are you?
Doing well. Doing
You
well.
look good. You look good.
Retirement's working for me. Well, Byron, you know, you've been doing rate setting for 32 years. I mean, you could probably lead this course on what you've seen and managed messaging for a long time, and you do a good job with it.
Well, we try. I think that was very kind of you. I've spent most of my career in corporate finance, so the last half of my career has really been in rates. So it hadn't been nearly my entire age, but it's has been more recently. Yeah. But I appreciate all you've done for the state. You've done a great job.
Appreciate it.
And I do like Bonnie. Bonnie is one of my favorites.
Byron and I have
will be, always has been.
Okay. But I'm gonna ask very indulgently of myself if I can take the microphone for a minute, and Byron, I'm gonna follow on what you just said and let the rest of this group know, and Becca and Clint in particular will appreciate this from a solar development perspective, I mean, Grant was without a doubt an integral part of the 2014 Act in South Carolina, the Distributed Energy Resource Act, and moving our state from where we were to where we were then, and then also helping move us beyond that point recently. And you know, Grant, you are one of the most humble leaders that I've ever been able to interact with, and you don't take credit for what you did, but Grant put his heart into it, but he also put his head into it, and he is incredibly intelligent and well versed and studied and thoughtful, and it was critical. I know, I'm sorry, I'm going to do this because you retired, and that's when people laud other individuals, and you deserve it. I mean, he was a real important cog in that wheel as it was turning, and it took a lot of getting in the car and driving to Columbia and sitting in the office at the electric cooperatives off on Knox Abbott Drive for hours upon hours upon hours. You know, a 2-hour meeting that ended up lasting 5 hours into 8 o'clock at night on a Friday night type long conversations around minor phrases and words, and the renewable stakeholder group at large, and I would say really the citizens of our state, you know, owe a lot to you for the work that you put in on a volunteer basis. And I thank you for that. And I know Byron was just alluding to the same thing. So we're going to miss you being so actively involved, but we're not going to let you not be involved at all.
You know, Grant, the first thing I remember about solar is Grant Reeves. It was like synonymous. So you were the first mover, an early mover, and so I'll never forget that. You're a leader in solar.
So Grant, Bonnie, and Byron have done a good job. And I actually made note of this as you're talking. I want to come back to this. And they did a great job of bringing it out. They described the what that you did. But to put this in context, at that time, you were a senior leader in InterTech Group. And this was really more than your job.
Yeah.
You know, if you'd just done your job, you wouldn't have done all of this stuff that Byron and Bonnie just described. I'm, you know, from the standpoint of some leadership learning, if you could step back and if you could share with this group, why did you do that? Because it really wasn't your job, Grant, to do this. So why did you do this?
Wow, that's really great question. And the answer is, as a leader, you don't have a defined job. You know, you do what you think needs to be done when it needs to be done, and you weigh, you know, can you be effective? I mean, what Bonnie didn't say is in 2013, we beat up the utilities and had lots of headlines, but nothing got done. And the next year, I said, if we're going to do it, we're going to accomplish something. We're going to, you know, try a different approach. We're going to, you know, essentially go with what, you know, we can get accomplished. And so you say it's not my job, but it became my job when I realized there was an opportunity to do something positive. And so there's another person that needs to be recognized, and that's Anita Zucker. Anita Zucker gave me the ability to spend time on public policy. She supported, you know, organizations like SCIBA and the Solar Business Alliance and you know, SMA. And so we had the support of my corporate benefactor, and I worked on things that I like to work on. And as a leader, that's really what you're striving for, is to control your agenda, you know, be in a position where you get to decide what you work on, because that's what's going to, you know, help whatever your mission is. I had a lot of missions when I was working with Bonnie in 2014. I think I was, you know, president of PBI. I was CEO of a Canadian public company called Circa. I was working with the Solar Business Alliance. I was building solar facilities, some of the first ones in South Carolina. So really just wearing a lot of different hats, and leaders do. I mean, some of you don't get the luxury of, having a side gig. Your employer expects you to be 100%, on company business. But, we're a little bit unique at the InterTech Group. We were encouraged to have side gigs, multiple gigs. And as long as you could juggle those balls and deliver results, that was a great model. So yeah, throughout my career at the InterTech Group, I always ran 2 or 3 different projects or portfolio companies. But here's the thing. You can't abdicate being hands-on and detail-oriented. Just because you're doing more than one thing doesn't mean that you can, fly at a high level. You got to be in the details. If there's one thing that I see with some of my less performing individuals these days, is they don't take the time in the details. If you don't read every word in a contract, if you don't understand your spreadsheet, if you're just glazing over things because you're overworked and there's no time, you better be really good. You better be really good at knowing what to gloss over and what's important. That's really a key skill, when you can figure out what's your priority and what requires more time and less time, and just making those decisions on a constant basis. You can't do everything, and you're never going to get everything to 90%. You got to make decisions. I think somebody said there's the 47 rule, where the probability of a good outcome lies between 40% and 70% of all the information you need. If you got less than 40% of the information, the probability of an good outcome is pretty poor. And if you wait until you got more than 70% of the information you need, the opportunity is probably passed, or the question has changed. So somewhere between 40 and 70% of the information is what you need to make a good probable outcome. But anyway, I kind of just go on there. Thank you.
So Grant, we're coming up on an hour. I'm going to ask you to comment on one last topic. Yeah. And you brought it up in your comments over the past few minutes when you talked about the relationship and the approach that you and Anita Zucker had to leading. I know you're acquainted with Jim Rogers. Jim Rogers had the same approach, and that philosophy is that leadership doesn't stop at your property line, and that when you're leading an organization, whether it's a team or whether it's a company, that your leadership actually extends out into the community, into the state, into the nation. Could you talk with us just a little bit about that, and how taking that approach really does come back to creating value for your company?
Well, certainly, so these trade on their reputation, their brand. What is a brand? A brand is something you trust because it's proven itself, and you don't have to, recheck it every time. You get consistency. So that's what brands are. You trust them. And so brands, have spokespersons, and that's the leaders in the company that speak about their products, or maybe they just speak about current events. But how they respond, adds to their reputation. And clearly, someone like Anita Zucker, who gives a lot of time to civic matters and speaking, enhances her reputation by the words that she speaks and the time that she puts in. And so it does extend further. People, recognize your company and your brand because they've heard you speak, and you said something intelligent that mattered. And yeah, so I think as you take opportunities to speak about a subject, do it thoughtfully. And if you're not well prepared, don't just say something to fill the air. I think it's always best to say less. I'm not living by my own advice today, but it's always better to say less, but to say it well. And to your question, about reputation and how you work as a leader, yeah, you have to be visible. You have to stand for something. You have to have credentials that people understand what your credentials are. Why do they trust you? What created that? And then don't ever destroy your reputation by firing off an unthoughtful comment, especially in writing. If you got something that's a little sensitive, best to sleep on it.
Grant, thank you very much. Appreciate you spending an hour with us today.